Hello and welcome to everybody, and a special warm welcome from me as the present chairman to Alfred Fisher, Vice President and past chairman of the Society, who is going to give the talk this evening on his work and influences. Before I hand over to Steve Clare, who will be in charge for the rest of the evening, I would just like to remind you that questions will be taken afterwards. And if you want to ask one, press the chat button at the end of your screen and type, and it will be answered. Enjoy yourselves.
Well, thank you, Caroline. Welcome, everyone. This is the latest in a series of webinars that the Society's been very energetic about organising, and thankfully kept things really lively. We've had a fantastic series of webinars so far, very enjoyable, and I'm hugely looking forward to Alf's one. The next one, I should say, in May is going to be conservation based, and it will feature Tobit Curtis and Dr. Robin Pender, and it will deal with collaboration between conservation scientists and conservators, and it may well turn into a half-day event. We're still discussing that. And then in June, we look forward very much to Julie Sloan talking about American stained glass, which should be terrific. When I was asked to introduce Alf and to field the questions, I was more than happy to do so, because I've known and worked with Alf for a very long time. Over 35 years ago now, it seems incredible. I worked at the Glass House with Caroline and her father, so I'm in the company of two people that have been very helpful to me in my career. And after moving from the Glass House, I went and worked for Alf for 10 years, which was hugely enjoyable. And Alf tonight will deal exclusively with his creative work, but as you will all know, he was one of the trailblazers for independent conservation studios, and certainly through his support I developed my passion for conservation of stained glass, so I'm enormously grateful for that. But I think generally it's Alf's tremendous knowledge and generosity that's so well respected. I was asked some years ago why he was held in such high esteem, and it's simply because of his generosity of spirit in that over many years in encouraging people in their careers. And when you meet with almost any group of stained glass professionals, as over the years, there's never a room full of people where someone hasn't benefited from Alf's general generosity of spirit and sharing knowledge. It's been pivotal in many careers, not least mine. This contribution goes into other fields of stained glass apart from conservation, and I know that Alf will probably talk about his work in India and the tremendous vitality stemming from his original input. I was very lucky to be part of that, and look forward to reminiscing about that. As Caroline said, I'll put questions to Alf at the end, and apologies in advance if there are a lot of them and I don't get to all of them, but we'll hand over to Alf now with the warmest of welcomes, and look forward very much to what you have to say, Alf.
Good evening. Welcome to many old friends. I hope you can all hear me. A great welcome to you all. As I say, a lot of old friends and possibly one or two new friends. A few years ago, I gave a talk to this society on 50 years in stained glass. And at the time, I thought, crikey, I felt quite a dinosaur then. To my horror, I realised that it's now 70 years stained glass. And so there's quite a lot of water gone under the bridge since then. The glass painters I was closely involved with from about 1961 to about 1989. And all I'm going to talk about tonight is purely reminiscences, one or two flashbacks to earlier days of the glass painters, mainly reminiscences. And that was an incredible time of development of stained glass. It really was a huge amount of progress in that period, not just in the development of the stained glass itself, but in the development of the master glass painters who couldn't resist what was going on, and of course in my own development. So the three strands I'm going to talk about tonight: my own work, the master glass painters, and developments in stained glass in that period. After that, I'm going to talk about something which I've mentioned, but I've never talked about seriously before, and that is our work in India, because the value of that is only just apparent, and it is quite astonishing. And I just would like to share with you some of the experiences and some of the work that's out there. So that is the final part of the talk. Now, when I started work, it was at a place called Whitefriars. This is the symbol of Whitefriars, which most of you will know, I'm sure, but it's a Carmelite monk, because Carmelites had a monastery on the banks of the Thames, and Whitefriars had the glassworks there from, they say, about 1680. Well, that remained the symbol of the glasswork for a very long time. So I started there, and it was incredibly Victorian system. And it was 1951, and it was still totally Victorian. Most of the old studios were Victorian. And I want to tell you a bit about it, because it'll show you the sort of people and the mindset of the people who set up the glass painters and are still running the glass painters in those days. Now, I went there from art school, and my boss then was Caroline's father, which is Carl Edwards. I mean, I was only 17. Then I had to go and do national service. And when I came back, everything had changed, because he had left to start on his own. And if we go from one hoodie to another hoodie, this was who had replaced him. And this is Edward Little Armitage. And he looks pretty grumpy there. He wasn't grumpy at all, but I do love characters. And you have to say it, he was an absolutely amazing character. He had worked for Henry Holiday. He'd worked for Cole Parsons. So he'd been around quite a bit. And from about 1950, he started working at Whitefriars. As you see, he was just something special. He was a designer at Whitefriars, but he was also a gentleman farmer in Suffolk. And he came in on Monday morning on the train to King's Cross somehow. And he was apparently always knitting on the train. And those socks that you see in this little sketch, he knitted them all himself. He'd arrive at Harrow Wealdstone about 11 o'clock on a Monday morning. He'd reach the studio about 11:15, because fortunately the pubs opened at 11 o'clock. So he was able to have a quick pint before he turned up. Very nice chap to work with. But the important thing about it was that this was my introduction to the Master Glass Painters. He was the secretary of the Master Glass Painters. What I didn't realise, of course, that he'd been trying to get out of being the Master Glass Painter for about 4 years. And when I got up into the studio, he saw me as a sitting duck. So he managed to get me to first become his assistant secretary, and then in about 1961, The place itself, Whitefriars, it was totally hierarchical. It was a complete strata of society. At the top were the designers. I don't think they ever signed in or booked in. They just went as they wanted. Below that was the artists or cartoonists. And they were the people who were doing full-size drawings for the scale designs of the designer. So they solely worked in black and white. They stood at their easels all day. And all they did was to more or less enlarge the work of the designers into full-size drawings and then cut lines. Going down a level with the painters, and painters were painting on glass, of course, as you all know. They were a level down. They used to clock in, but I think they protested and they were allowed eventually to sign in a book when they arrived. Downstairs were the cutters and glazers. They were treated in the same way as the workers in the factory. They had to clock in on a machine when they arrived. And below the cutters and glazers were the cementers. Now, the cementers were in some corrugated iron annex which had been thrown onto the side of the building. And in there were the cementers. And there was also the trainee cementer. That was me. I was also the gents' urinal cleaner. I had to mix up the cement because it was homemade, all homemade, and I was shoveling red lead into it, for not but it was part of my duty. For some reason, I'm still alive. So that is the outline of it was an upstairs and downstairs situation, no doubt about it. I think around about 1960, there were smart magazines there called Tatler and Illustrated London News. And I think this was Illustrated London News, but it was a glossy magazine. And they had a chap called Dennis Flanders who was very skilled at going around doing illustrations. And fortunately, he came to the studio and he drew there. And I think you'd appreciate this is much better than a photograph because you can pick out people. You can see a fellow on the left, which is me. Look at as if I'm leaning on my drawing, but I'm not. I was just a boy, the junior, so I'm only drawing bits of pastry. There was Archie from Wales, Marjorie Walters, Colwyn Morris, John Cleburne, and Aidan Savage. Now, three of them, Archie, Marjorie, and Colwyn, they were from the Swansea School of Art, which was a very great training ground for Whitefriars. Lots of Swansea people came there, and it didn't just finish then. So that's the upstairs. On the far wall, there was a mosaic, which is very dirty and smutty. And at the sides, behind these easels, there was, I think, 4 Burne-Jones drawings, Rossetti's first drawing for stained glass. And we thought they were just so awful, we couldn't look at them. The paper was brown. It looked like as if it had been stained in tea. And not only that, the glass was dirty, so we thought we were just absolutely dirty. This is the mosaic. It's a languorous lady, very brave, sitting down between 2 tigers, but she is now in the refectory in St Paul's Cathedral, and she looks very smart there too. So it's a reproduction of mosaics that were done in the Dome of St Paul's. I think they were designed by Salviati, but all the mosaics there were done by Whitefriars. This is the Rossetti drawing, which is slightly flattering, actually, but you'll agree with we could be forgiven for not falling down in adoration in front of it. Downstairs, this is the painting studio, and there would be probably up to 4 or 5 painters and a couple of trainee lads there usually. There's only 4 of them showing there. On the left is a photographer's room. We had a full-time photographer. In the corner there is Charlie Watson. I think he came from Burleson and Grills. One of the young lads was called Bob. Somebody hiding there. And Fred White, who was one of the painters, a bit of a grumpy individual, Fred, but he did warm up eventually. What I've talked about before is down here, bottom side bottom left was a kiln. And there was so much work going on in the post-war years that they had a kilnsman who did nothing but fire the glass. And as you recall, if you're firing glass, there are long periods when you're not actually doing anything. You're just standing waiting for it to warm up. So as a result, he talked to everybody who went by because he had nothing else to do. And if you were careful, you could go by Jim and make sure that he was talking to somebody already. Otherwise, you'd be there for about half an hour. Anyway, he died suddenly, unexpectedly. A few months later, we took on a young boy I'd call Les. His job was to come in the morning at 7 or 7:30 to sweep up the place. In those days, you didn't worry about paint dust. There was paint dust flying everywhere. Anyway, he came in one morning, and when the others came in at 8 o'clock, found him sitting on a stool, white as a sheet. And Les described how in this corner by the kiln, he'd seen a man standing. And he'd never been in when Jim was there. And he described Jim down to a T. So that is one Whitefriars ghost who's probably still around. And poor lad, he didn't last. He left the following week. He couldn't take it anymore. The Blazers were downstairs, and they were completely separate. The two didn't mix very much. So we're back here to Armitage. Hero Army, we call him, of course, obviously. He was brilliant with clients, especially old ladies. If old ladies were going to leave a window, he had them in the palm of his hand. I remember going in once very worried because I used to put the lettering on his designs and mount them. And I went in and I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Armitage, I hope I'm not being very forward, but you've got Christ in Majesty here." And he's got his hand raised and he's got 5 fingers and 1 thumb. And he said, he said, "I know that." He said, "Don't worry." He said, I think it was Carl Parsons said, "Every client loves a deliberate mistake. Make sure you put a mistake in every design you do and you'll have a very happy client." You can believe that. But he was a funny lad. He maintained, despite being a Suffolk squire, he maintained, straight enough, he was a communist, you see. But he wanted to get on to Kensington Council, and he couldn't get on as a communist for obvious reasons. He was conservative and got on immediately. That was a little Armitage. So anyway, I was roped in to run the Glazers company, which was absolutely moribund. It really was. It did very little. It did have 3 meetings a year, I think, for the council. It had an annual dinner and it had a journal. Now, the annual dinner was very splendid because it had a lot of very important people as vice presidents then. That was their main thing. They had an annual general meeting, of course. And when I was researching this, I found that I'd written that there was great support for the annual exhibition. Well, I never remembered an annual exhibition. And if there's anybody around from those times, I'm sure they don't. But what I deduced in the end, it was that those who went to the annual general meeting, their latest designs on the shelf at the Artworkers Guild, and everyone went round and said nice things or nasty things. They were minded. One of the better things was the library. They did have a decent library, and that was at the time taken over by Hugh Salmon. And Hugh and Bob Salmon were great supporters of the society. They ran the glass suppliers, Hetley's, and were quite active, really. And of course, being suppliers, they knew everybody and they knew everything that was going on. The annual dinner, it was my job to book it and book the speakers. And I think the first one I got was the speaker was the keeper or the man in charge of the V&A Museum. And the dinner was at the Café Royal, and it was responded to by none other than Patrick Renshans, because that was 1962, and it was the time of Coventry, of course. I did manage get as a speaker the Lord Fisher, of all people, who had been the Archbishop of Canterbury. I thought that was a bit of a coup to get to the glass painted on one occasion. The real boss, the president, was in fact the Marquis of Salisbury, and he was really one of the most powerful people in the land. He knew everybody, and we were very lucky to get him. And he did come to the dinners, and I managed to say to him one year, look, can't we have our dinner at your place at Hatfield House? And he agreed, and I managed to get either the dinner, I can't remember if it was a dinner or a lunch, but we got a tour of Hatfield House, and that was probably one of the first occasions that we got the glass painters out of their London base. This is 1921, 100 years ago, when we first started. And I just wanted to show you, these are the originators. These are people who set themselves up to become the council of the society. And if you look at these people, 80% of them ran very successful, very large studios. Percy Bacon, Bain, R.T. Bain, Heaton, Butler and Bain, Reginald Bell, Clayton and Bell, T.H. Grills, Burleson and Grills, John Hardman, Hardman's in Birmingham, Hutchinson of Whitefriars, Nicholson, A.K. Nicholson Studios, Marriott Powell of Whitefriars, Walter Tower, who was the final designer for Kemp's. So they were all there, and they were the bigwigs of commercial enterprises. They were not the sort of social nature of people that we are today. It was a very different setup. They'd made out that they were not to be a trade union, but they were in fact, without doubt, an employers' organisation. These are the Memorandum of Association. They set out to promote, encourage and assist everybody, formulate usages and customs, to collect and disseminate professional information, all the sort of things that they're supposed to do, but they didn't really do very much about it. Big jump here to 1962 when I took over, and as I said, the Marquis of Salisbury was the president, and the Earl of Euston was the vice president, who used to chair the meetings, and he was the ultimate aristocrat. He was absolutely poised, absolutely like a ramrod, very tall, beautifully spoken, and I admired him. He was very, very good to us. Still terrified me. He was chairman of the SPAB, Society of Protection of Ancient Buildings, which was just down the road. So we met about 3 times a year. He chaired the meetings, but that was really the only contacts that were with him. One of our jobs was to send out, of course, messages to the members. And in fact, there were only 150 members. I think you've got about 450 now. There's only 150 members, and I had to write them 3 or 4 times a year. I had to write out 150 envelopes by hand. And by the time of it, I'd finished. By the time I finished, I knew most of these addresses off by heart. And if you look at these people, look at the people there, Armitage at the top, Arabelle, Fred Cole, of course, he ran Whipple of Exeter. Harcourt Doyle was on his own in Liverpool. Feeney of Hardman's. Moira Forsyth was independent, very nice person. Harry Harvey of York. Harper and Hendra, they used to do the work for that chap who did all the Westminster Abbey. Very smooth technique. Honestly, Howard Martin ran the college at Swansea, and Keith New, Nutchins, that's just the first page. So I knew their addresses, and the best one entirely was Edward Payne, and he was triangle, box, crowd, gloss. So there's 4 lines with just one word on each. And then there was opposite end, there was Nora Yoxall and Elsie Whitford, and their address was Red Lion Steps, Blockley, Morton in the Marsh. And of course I had to write this several times a year. And I thought, why don't they get off those steps and pop in? I'll just have a nice sherry and all of that. So that's the glass painters as I found them. So where was I all this time? And it was all this little fella, he was the cause of it all. He liked singing, loved singing, and he loved drawing. He never stopped him drawing. So in the end, he went to a school just around the corner here called the Liverpool Institute. And it happened to be the school that supplied the choir boys to the cathedral here. And it happened to be next door to the art school, which was also very useful. So I went through the Liverpool Institute, and I was followed by some quite notable people a few years later, named George Harrison or McCartney. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. But anyway, I got an audition and I got in the choir school. And a few years later, Paul McCartney went for an audition at the cathedral. And he, unlike me, he didn't get in. They said, your voice ain't good enough. So he didn't get in. Rather sad, because poor old Mecca, he might have been quite famous by now if he'd got in the choir school. But he didn't. I did. So the cathedral sort of formed my background. I was a choir boy. It didn't look like this. It was only half finished when I was there. And I sat at the far end on the left. And I looked at this terrible, gloomy window above me on the left, the east window. It was awful, and it still is. I don't know what anybody said. It's awful. And opposite me were two windows that had been boarded in because they'd been blown out during the war. And I looked at them. And one day in 1946, everything had changed because one of those windows was replaced and unveiled. And it was the most gorgeous window. It was done by Powell's, and it was a Hogan design, one of his last. And it was beautiful. It sparkled. It was lively. It was bright. It was green. It's called the Emerald Window. And I fell in love with it, and it transformed me. And I really liked stained glass from that moment on. And the dean was very keen to have, he was a friend of Bassani. I don't know how he got to know him. He wanted to have Bassani windows in the cathedral. And Sir John Scott, the architect, he said, I'm not having anything in that cathedral that detracts from my architecture. My architecture is supreme. And I thought that was pretty mean at the time. But I have to admit, looking at this, I think if Masoni did anything like this in the cathedral, you wouldn't have the architect. And the other thing is, it would be very, very dark indeed. And when I was in the choir school there, and I saw these Whitefriars windows that I admired, and I learnt about Bassani, I couldn't possibly have dreamt that a few years further on, I'd be working for Whitefriars, and I'd be moonlighting for Bassani each day when I finished work at Whitefriars. I was off to see him. So I was doing this pretty humdrum stuff at Whitefriars. These were New Zealand windows, and they're very traditional and very polished from drawing and painting. And this is one of my advisors that came in one day for a little chat. And that's the sort of thing I hadn't seen anything much else. Everything changed in 1959 because I got a scholarship. So I got 2 weeks off for 2 years on the run to go to Europe. And that was, of course, absolutely mind-boggling. To go from little windows like that in a traditional Whitefriars way and to see things like this. This was by Barrier. This was by Le Chevalier. This was by Max Ingres in Rouen Cathedral. And this was Marc Chagall in Metz. Can you imagine the difference in concept it gave to me? And everything changed around about the same time because Coventry Cathedral was launched in 1962. And I had to go up there to look at it. And I admired it immensely, but I admired even more the Clear Window by John Hutton at the West End. But although John Piper had done some windows for Arundel a few years before, nobody took too much notice. But they couldn't ignore this. Even the master glass painters couldn't ignore this. And I don't know many people know this, but the master glass painters were absolutely boiling over at this because they all ran firms. And this was done by college. And they objected left, right, and centre because they believed this was done without the overheads of a firm. It was done without having to pay the staff. And they.
Excuse me, Alf. Sorry to intrude. The sound keeps dipping in and out. Do you think you could try getting a bit closer to the mic?
Yeah. Okay. The master glass painters were absolutely so angry about this. But in fact, they had to acknowledge in the end that that it was come, that the change had come, and they had to just wake up and go with it. This is a bit later on. This is about the 80s, and the whole constitution of the glass painters had changed. The Earl of Euston had become the president. He was now the Duke of Grafton, and I got in to be chairman. And the people on the council, you'll notice somebody called Caroline Benyon there, and she's still there. Congratulations, Caroline. That was a long time ago. Paul Quayle, Paul Sancassiani, Caroline Swatch, Brian Thomas, Alan Younger. These are all artists. It was artists that were running the society by that time in the 80s. There was a big changeover that was affected by two people who you see on that list. Now, in the mid-60s, there was an annual general meeting, and it was pretty boring, pretty tedious. At the end of it, a young lady got up on her feet, which is most unusual because they're all old codgers. Well, this young lady got on her feet, and she proceeded to tell the glass painters what they weren't doing and what they should be doing. And I thought this was absolutely marvellous because I wanted it to happen for a long time, but I hadn't the time to do it myself. And this person was, in fact, I don't want to embarrass her. Yes, I do. Caroline Swash. And it was very fortunate that I had all sorts of Irish. I thought, yeah, she's a good one. I did an Armitage. I thought she could succeed me as secretary. But in fact, there was somebody in between. Lord Euston wanted to resign as chairman. And my successor secretary knew somebody called Michael Snow. Michael Snow and Caroline Swash formed a duo that was an absolute hurricane and completely changed the face of the glass painters forever. And between them, turned into what it is now. He was great fun. He was vigorous. He was enthusiastic. He was ebullient. The important thing was, though, that he was very well connected. He used those connections on our behalf. And within a few years, this dynamic duo, they had really shaken us the call. And he'd arranged exhibitions. We had first exhibition, I think, was at RABA, Institute of British Architects. We had other exhibitions all over the place, the Building Centre, Anderson's. So the glass painters was pulling together, and it was acting for its people. It was the first time this had happened, that they were really pulling together. And they weren't on their own. They will admit that. A lot of other people joined them, and it was a time of great change. Caroline produced a newsletter. For the first time, that brought in people. They knew what was going on for the first time. Her neighbour, Sheila Mole, became secretary. She converted that into a more substantial newsletter. And finally, Phillida Shaw came on the scene, and she transformed it into an actual magazine, a glossy magazine. It wasn't illustrated except on the cover. We couldn't afford that. And this one, as you see here, 1989, was the demise of Hartley Woods, the glassmakers in Sunderland, who had been one of the best glassmakers in the world. And I have to qualify that next to Whitefriars, of course, it's a different sort of glass. So the glass painters fought against the closure of that. And they brought together glass painters of all different types. They brought together the colleges. The colleges started having exhibitions. We made contact with all sorts of people. And I think probably the ultimate thing was 1982, when they had an exhibition in Chartres that Michael Snow and Caroline Benyon organised. Caroline Benyon and Tony Benyon actually carried out the donkey work of getting all the glass to there. And a nightmare on the paperwork, and thank them for that. But it was a tremendous success, and really the glass painters had come of age again, the new glass painters. And it was the forerunner of what you see today. And I'm very glad that it is still going, and it is still very successful at the moment. So that is a bit about the glass paint. See how my work was going, how I could cope with this revolution. Obviously a bit cautious. I couldn't suddenly start doing massive abstract things in Whitefriars, but I did get a chance to do some designs, and I wanted to get away from this idea of a figure on a plain background, just like a postage stamp on a letter, and to try and amalgamate the background with the figure. This is, and also to loosen up the painting and not have the painting so tidy, and to make the painting part of the design, and amalgamate the painting and the leading in a better way. I got a job of doing a window in New Zealand, and I thought, they're very conservative out there. I could go mad. It had to be relatively conventional. But I wanted it to be much looser and much freer. And I was fortunate I got Paul Jeffries. I don't think any of the conventional painters wanted to do it, but fortunately, Paul Jeffries, who joined the studio, he painted it, one of the first things he ever painted. And he took a completely different idea of the painting. And we got a sort of luminosity and a quality that we hadn't had before in our work. We were still doing traditional work. This was a section of a window for St. Thomas, New York, and this depicts some Arapaho Indians at prayer. The windows for New York were started in the 1920s by that marvellous man James Hogan, who actually saved Whitefriars in the 20s and 30s. And the lovely rich windows, and we did one every few years. Don't be too disappointed. If you go to St. Thomas Fifth Avenue, you're going to be disappointed. These wonderful windows were gorgeous when they were put in, but now there's skyscrapers on either side of the church, and they're virtually black. I got a chance to do a window for New Zealand, a very large one, and I just didn't want to use any ruby. It was practically the whole end wall of a church, the Methodist mission in Auckland. I knew it if I used ruby, it would dominate the whole place. I didn't want to do that. So as an exercise, I designed a window without any ruby at all, any blues and greens and purples, and this was the result. It was a painted window, but with the paint used in a completely different way. And the window by now is packed in packing cases somewhere in Auckland. We don't know where. The church was pulled down many years ago. The last days at Whitefriars, the concrete glass was coming in, and I wanted to prove that we could do a stunning window in leaded glass as they were doing in concrete glass. And this was the result of one attempt at that. This is at Kempston near Bedford. And I've got long swathes of very dark green neutral glass to give a density to it and a quality to it. And it was really the last fling of Whitefriars glass. And if you want to see some Whitefriars glass in context with Kempston. Another church that was not finished in the 30s, and we're given this challenge. If you look at it, this is in Abbey, Yorkshire. Terrible tracery. Look at all those 200 plus pieces of tracery. And Britannia told me that if you get some nasty tracery, you can overcome it with your own designs. So this is one of the first windows we did at Chapel Studio later, beautifully painted by Peter Archer. But you see how we've managed to lose this awful tracery and get a great blaze of colour and cutting out that dreadful lighting. We weren't just doing our own work. We were doing work for other people at Whitefriars. This is one of the Canterbury windows for Canterbury Cathedral, yes, the Bassani windows. Just back onto that one. Very rich, amazing work. But we didn't do any of the painting or the cutting. It was just the glazing that was done at Whitefriars. Now, this was the glazers, the glass painters. Glass painters were changing because of all this revival of Michael Snow and Caroline, and we're going places. And this is Paul Tancociani on the left, and my wife Pam and my friend Seth. I think it was one of the Oxford colleges, but I hope somebody doesn't tell me it's Cambridge. Not going to be a problem. But glass painters went around. I took them to Liverpool one year. We went to see Paddy's wigwam there. We went inside, and I still think this is one of the most powerful places that I've ever seen, showing the power of stained glass to change the atmosphere of a building. It is absolutely stunning, and if you haven't been, please do go. And we took a ferry across the Mersey. Why? Because I wanted them to see some Bassani windows. And these are at a Methodist church at Port Sunlight. And this one I want to share with you because you'll see this wonderful image, this dark-skinned person with these very bright eyes. It's tremendously forceful. Some of you, the older people among you, might know that in the transept, I think it's the north transept at Chartres, there's a big rose window and there's a row of figures beneath. And there was a figure of the Virgin Mary. And she had a very dark skin like this and very bright eyes. And Bassani saw this, and he obviously took it on board, and he loved it. And he used this image in this window. And I think it is stunning. But in fact, he got it under completely false pretenses, because many, many years later, they cleaned this window at Chartres and found that, in fact, this Virgin is not dark brown, but is actually a pale pink. And so it's a great shame. I should go back. Can't do that. Then we got on our way back to Liverpool, where we found actually that when we got there, we were too short because two of the ladies were still chatting, and they'd come back to Liverpool, they'd forgotten to get off, and they're on their way back to Birkenhead. And if they're listening, please remind me who they were, because I can't remember. Now, in 1973, Peter Arch and I left Whitefriars. The work was going down, the amount of work was going down. We felt we could do better. And we found this little deserted chapel down the road from my house, and we started a new career there. We did, in fact, do very well. This is the inside. It's had disadvantages and didn't have a very good show window, but we had a great time there and produced quite a lot of interesting work. One of our first commissions, and this, I suppose, was the first time that I was able to evolve my own style. And Peter Archer painted it and did very well in assimilating this style. This was for a new Catholic church just outside Liverpool. And it was, I told the vicar, you must have it protected, you must have polycarbonate. So one day I was up there putting this window in, and the priest came up and he said, "You're all right?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "I still think you should protect this window." "Oh, no," he said, "my boys will do as they're told." And just that moment, something whistled past my head and hit the window. And of course, it was a stone. I said, "Hey, I told you this would happen." I said, "Don't worry." He said, "Don't worry." He said, "That wasn't meant for the window. That was meant for you." So I said, "Oh, thanks very much. That's great." Anyway, when it came to the lower level in this church, we decided we'd be better off with verre or concrete and glass, and that's what we put on the other side of the altar. Is the sound all right, Steve, now? You get to do all sorts of interesting things, and you don't necessarily have to do what you're expected to do. These are some fragments that were found in some packing cases in Winchester Cathedral. And they were brought to me, and they wanted them put in a background of quarries. And I said, "No, I just can't do that. They look terrible because the quarries can be quite dominant, and all the white dot around them will mean that you won't see any detail whatsoever. Let's mask them, and let's do a background a modern background which will enhance the place. And that's what we did in the end. And apart from the fact somebody putting a bit of tracery back to front on the top right, it was very nice. Glass painters continue to have exhibitions. This is one of mine for a panel. There's more to it than meets the eye. It's a bit of a spoof. We'd had German glass rammed down our throat for quite a long time by a few people, and the colleges were taking it up. I did a little panel just to try and prove the beauties of English glass, so there's some lovely Hartleywood streaky there, and also the fact that painted glass wasn't forgotten. We couldn't put it aside. It was very English, and I did this little painted panel showing the painted glass sort of gradually creeping through the louvers of the German at the top. We did some windows, two windows for Carpenter's Hall. Very interesting. I do like windows of the purpose. Carpenter's Hall is lined with lovely quality wood. Two big windows were in plain glass, and they were very worried in the days of the IRA that they had a lot of dinners there with royalty. And of course, they would have been an actual sitting duck if somebody's taken a picture from a building. So we were commissioned to do a couple of windows on the theme of the wall. So I thought it'd be very nice if we could get this nice wooden coloured glass, which is German and semi-opalescent. It carries on the tint of the walls, and then we put in the arms of the Carpenters Company in the middle there. I love it. It's one of my favourite windows because the glass is slightly opalescent, but the blue borders and the rest of it are not. And you get this sparkle and this contrast between the clear glass of the borders and the opalescent. Talking of dinners, I forgot to mention that one of the advantages of being on the secretary of the glass painters was that you got invited to the annual dinner of the Worshipful Company of Glazers in the Mansion House of all places. And I have told you before of our intrepid trip, my first trip to town to such a dinner. My wife and I did, and we went up to town in our little Morris Minor, and we were presented with 6 courses, 6 glasses of wine, regularly topped up, not to mention the champagne reception before. And we drove home merrily, 20 miles. Later on, while on that subject, when I was master of the Glazers, my partners and I used to go to a lot of dinners in the Mansion House. And on one occasion, my partner, Peter Archer, and my, by then, other partner, Bob Holloway, were coming back. And it was the days of the IRA. And there was a barrier across London Bridge. And they'd had quite a lot to drink, I must say. And a policeman came up and stopped them and said, can I see your identity? And they were absolutely petrified because they thought they were really going to be caught. And Bob produced a card that said, Robert Holloway, stained glass. And the policeman said, oh, he said, stained glass? He said, oh, that's interesting. He said, my best mate is stained glass. He said, do you know him? He said, chap called Brian Clark. He said, I was at school with him. And so Bob said, well, actually, he was at the party at our house last week. So the policeman said, oh, don't say out. He says, just carry on, get on your way. So it was good to have friends at times. As many of you will know, I did a series of panels for Westminster Abbey. They were devoted to benefactors to the Henry VII's chapel. And this chap was a very wealthy man from Hong Kong. And the lovely thing about these, you could incorporate symbols of people's life and what they'd done. And this I love because if you've got this Chinese badge there, I've got a little junk, and this actually is his wife, but the symbols are very similar. It's a lovely series of windows to do, and these again were painted by Peter at the studio. This is my favourite, however. None of them have got any figures in them except this one. But Leopold Muller and his family did escape the Holocaust, as you can see at the bottom right. You can see the little swastika and the flames there. He founded a hotel chain, but he was a great benefactor, and particularly to a college called Genoa College, which looked after severely disabled children. And I admired this chap so much that I wanted to get one of these children in. So I put this very, very flat child, flatly painted figure in here. And it's still one of my favourite things that I've done. It was only fairly recently that I noticed that subliminally it's very similar to the disabled sign, which you'll see on many a loo door. But that's just coincidence, honestly. Sometimes one has to do something more personal, and it's very good to do it and much more simple. And you go into the realm of private houses, and this is one of the most simple windows I've ever done. But I relish again you realise by now that I love English glass. And so this is very simple from a painting point of view. I've got some lovely streaky tinted glass in it. And I was quite pleased, and so was a client, that do anything simple as that and yet still look effective and still see through it. Carrying on with private houses, this is Chequers. This is a sketch design, not the finished window. I've done, I think, 4 for Chequers, and I have actually stroked Maggie Thatcher's cat in the process, and I wielded Oliver Cromwell's sword, which is really something, quite heavy. But anyway, it's been fun doing the Chequers windows. This is one of the nicest, I think. There's a nice swing to it. Heraldry isn't tight. You can adapt heraldry, and you can swing things around. And these supporters are very nice. The seahorse on the left and the horse on the right. I wondered for a while, what on earth is that pattern down the middle? And then I had to ask, and somebody told me, well, of course, he was MP, and he was the MP for Broadstairs, and that is Broadstairs. So what about the top right in the shield? Well, he was famous for being a yachtsman, and his yacht was called Morning Cloud, and that's what it is. Heraldry through history has always been. Finally, the ultimate private house of all. This is a detail of windows for Buckingham Palace, which some of you have seen before. This was about 2000. And it was a commissioned by the Guards before the chapel. Chapel was destroyed in the war, so they converted a room into a chapel, really for the window. Before I started, I was told that the Duke of Edinburgh and stained glass don't mix, which was not very encouraging, I must say. But I also have to say that, as it happened, he was absolutely delighted. I'm not going to tell you what he said, but he was pretty happy. Now, Montreux came in the 50s. Prolific amount of stained glass, concrete variety, not Dal de Verre. He was a Frenchman, but he never heard of Dal de Verre, never used it, was never mentioned. He did a tremendous lot of this work for Whitefriars. And I took over when he retired. And this is an east window I did for a chapel near Darlington. A tremendous thing to be able to do, a whole chapel. This was the east window, and then there were windows down the sides, a lot of them. And I really enjoyed every bit of this. Sadly, after about 2 years, the whole lot was closed. About 10 years ago or less, it was demolished. I heard that the windows had been saved, and they were incorporated later into a very smart hotel and spa built on the site. If you want to swim under my windows, there you are. It'll cost you an arm and a leg, I can tell you. Then at Whitefriars, Keith Cummings came along and developed fused glass, which was very exciting. After a year, he left, and I had to take over. And later on, I got Paul Jeffries involved in it. This was one of the best windows I think he ever did. And beautiful colours, and it is now in the care of the Glazers Company in the library, I believe. It was designed originally as fused glass to free stained glass from the overtones of church work. And we did get a showroom to do. The first complete job we got was, in fact, a church full of these windows at Cuffley in Hertfordshire. And these are some of my panels for Cuffley. They were fortunately a rather nice narrow size, which made you do panels that would go in the kiln nice and easily. And this is one of my later panels with totally different colour. I told you I was impressed with John Hutton's window at Coventry. And I dabbled with a very nasty tool that the designers at Whitefriars table glass used to mark their numbers with on the base of vessels. It was a horrible thing. It vibrated a diamond, and I dabbled in this and had an exhibition. And to my amazement, John Hutton went to see it and later asked me to his studio, and it was so impressive. It was such a wonderful craftsman. It was very big materials, very big, enormous wheels, cutting wheels that I couldn't possibly use, but I didn't give up. I developed a technique using small diamond drills which would bounce across the glass and give you lovely effects that I really enjoyed. And I did a few panels like this, and I had great fun with them. Once I did something with the same materials, a very formal one. This was the Queen and the Duke opened the British Academy premises near Regent's Park, and I did this, and I'd always had a liking for Roman lettering, and I really enjoyed doing that as well. Then we went into a bit of sculpture, a bit of combining casting with engraving. I did a casting of one of Bassani's terracottas from the 30s, and I engraved this glass, which is the last one to show from for what's his name? John Thor. That's right, John Thor and Sheila Hancock, his wife. There was two of them for their daughters in the house on Thames. Right, then things changed. I had a call from Bernard Fieldon, and he said, "I've got three windows in Delhi in iron frames. I'm going to send them back to Chapel Studio for you to work on." I said, "Don't, for heaven's sake, they'll never get back. They'll be in pieces by the time they get here." And I'd partially retired. So I said, "Just send me instead, and I'll have a look at them." And I didn't hear anything for a few months. And then I heard again, and apparently he'd managed to get the British Council to fund me to go to India to see the state of stained glass in India. And I went to Calcutta, I went to Lucknow, I went to Delhi, I went to Agra, and I ended up here in Mumbai. And this is quite the most impressive building I saw in the whole trip. This is Victoria Terminus, which has another name now, in Mumbai. It is the most marvellous building. I mean, eat your heart out, St Pancras. This is fantastic. It combines Gothic with Saracenic work. It's got marvellous gargoyles. It's completely Gothic at the top. It's a wonderful building. And here's the booking office. And there is some of the incredible sculpture it has. There's a wonderful staircase. And at the top, where I went, there is some stained glass. And this is in 70s, I think, arms of the Great Indian Peninsula Railway. It is almost certainly it's based on English designs, but could have been made at the art school just over the road, where apparently Kipling's father was the principal. Anyway, what had happened was the panels had been taken out or blown out, and there was nobody, absolutely nobody, who could repair them and replace them. And this was a very clever panel that's been put in its place, and it was in fiberglass. And you have to admire, it was very clever. It didn't bear any resemblance to the original, but a very clever way of getting around a problem. It was put in back to front, which didn't help. Another one found here was put in with oil, because there wasn't anybody to do it in lead. So that's the sort of thing I found. I went to the Afghan church in Mumbai. That was pretty fantastic. To think that there was a time when I couldn't stand Victorian glass. And this is one of the most fantastic ones I've ever seen. And it's in good condition. Wales, 1857. So eventually I was asked to go out there and set up a team to teach them on the job to mend these windows. And I had to take somebody with me. So I rang up my friend Sepp War, the late War, and I said, do you want to come to India? And he took about an hour to decide and said yes. And so we set up a training course out there. This is the exterior of the windows. And you can see they're double glazed. And they set up the scaffolding for us. And this, I wouldn't denigrate this bamboo scaffolding. It is very good indeed when it's tied like that. There was one slight problem, and completely the wrong sort of toes. We couldn't stand on it, and we were quite outrageous in our demand. We demanded some scaffold boards, and they found some scaffold boards for us, and we carried on with that. Just a glimpse of the glass. It wasn't English. We think it was probably Italian, but we don't know. This was a panel after it was finished. It's got some scaffolding in front. The top half, you can see some repairs by copper foil, and it's all green. And we taught people. This was a chap, he was a painting restorer, so he learned painting. They set us up with a kiln, which was a nightmare because it never did the same thing twice. And they gave us the church hall. And here we can see stripping and cleaning going on. The chap on the right was the first contact with him, but I want you to remember him. His name is Mani Kandan. We're going to hear a bit more about him. He was on the course there. He followed me to Bombay and eventually set up his own workshop, which is why I call him. We went to see him a few years later, and he had his own team, and they had this work to do in Chennai. A pretty amazing place, and I think you'll see pretty dilapidated too. But they gave him a few benches, team along, worked in a corner, and they produced some magnificent work. And this is amazing. I don't know where it came from. I've never seen anything like this in England. But to their credit, they tackled several of these windows, far bigger tasks than I've ever tackled. And we went to see them when they were well advanced. Then now working on this window, which is in, I think, the law courts in Chennai. Again, fantastic stuff. And all because Mani was one of our best pupils, if you like. He invited us to his wedding last year. I don't normally put weddings on my lectures. Here he is on the left. His son is now working on the team, leading the team. He was married last year, a year ago, and his wife is, I gather, now also embroiled in the team. And this is a time when I want to say it's not just me, it's not just Sepp, it's a lot of you, because I got Mani, he came over to England. I got him over to England. And he went to Steve in Wells. He went to Godden Gibbs in London. He went to Jonathan Cook and Ruth Cook in Yorkshire. And he went to Sue Bradbury and Paul Lucky in Scotland. He was about 3 or 4 weeks with all these people. They gave him their time. They were master glance painters. They gave him their knowledge. And as a result of that, he is such a very successful artist. And I think it's thanks due to all of them for their part in it. The next escapade was quite different. It was in Mumbai. This is what's called the Maidan in Mumbai. It's a large open space. There's about 50 cricket was going on here. And if you look closely, you'll see why the Indians beat us last week with cricket. This is the university building. And we had a lot of work to do there. And we couldn't do it with 2 people. We took along a team. And this is a really awful photograph, but it just showed the pleasures that we had in going to work every morning. We had our little experts who came with us. There might have been one, there might have been three. We'd give them a couple of rupees and they'd be very happy, and they would talk. I've no idea what we're talking about, but they were such good company. We enjoyed so much our walk to work. It was always fine. These are the windows, and they're quite remarkable. We think they're Heaton, Butler and Bain, but I don't know. But they were mainly pattern work and very repetitive. You can see these are completely the same design, and there's probably about 32 panels the same in one window. So it was really a lot about marvellous Victorian stained glass painting, but it was wallpaper. There's no other word for it. We had a few problems with extra ventilation that they've got to deal with. Here's Steve at work taking a panel out. Here's Sepp doing some paintings because they couldn't produce the amount of painting in the time. And here's the kiln. Now, this time we sent our kiln ahead. We got a decent kiln. So that was a marvellous task. We went back the next year for a while. And this is the first panel that they ever glazed, and they were so proud of it. And well earned too. I don't normally put on photos of birthday cakes, but I put this on because it shows Manny here, who we've heard so much about, and our other star pupil is the lady on the right, whose name is Swati Changadkar. Let's get it right. And she also set up a workshop in Mumbai. Her husband went to work in Singapore, and she did a lot of work in Mumbai, but then went to Singapore and amazingly invited us out there to see her work and support her. And this is this is the Garrison Church in Singapore. I think it's pre-war, but the window is certainly post-war. And this is Gordon Webster of, I think, Glasgow. Pretty good face, but the rest of it is pretty good. Well in the building. Singapore couldn't imagine any more different to India. Everything is clean, tidy, precise, and well maintained. And this is a Catholic church. This was not very well maintained. We don't know what happened here. Something had been done, I think, to keep the water out. Then there are classical churches. This is a cathedral. They different requirements. They need a lot of air in. The bottom half of the windows is usually shutters and a little bit of stained glass in the top. The churches are very well kept, and this is Singapore Cathedral, where she was working with her team, beautifully maintained. These are Heaton, Butler and Bain and the West Wall. This is the main window they're working on at the time we went, which was about 1857, we think, 1860. But it's quite extraordinary grisaille work, and it had coats of arms in attributed to various people, and the badge of Stamford Raffles was in the wrong place and wrongly aligned. I'd like historians to look at this sometimes. I think it was re-leaded after the war. My own assumption is that there was probably a quite heavily painted Victorian grisaille window. And I think that probably it was re-leaded at some time, and you perhaps used the original pattern of leadwork, but abandoned all the painting work. So that was an enormous job that they were working on. They were given a workshop in the garden, a gardener's shed, and they had a wonderful team there and doing great work. And this is Scotty in charge on the scaffold. Me at one point, the only time I've ever worn a harness. We did allow them to stop for tea now and again. This great team fully deserved it. And this is me signing off the project. Now, I've got virtually to the end there's just one thing I wanted to say. I told you earlier that we walked down in Mumbai every morning, and these little children would follow us, and we loved seeing them. On my last visit, the others had gone back. I was on my own the final night. I went down to my favourite Chinese restaurant. I came back about 9:30 at night, and the kids were still up. They were still playing out. And I said, "Come on, girls." I said, "I'm going back to England tomorrow." And they knew what I meant. They didn't. They knew perfectly well what I meant. I said, "I want to see your mum and dad first." So they took my hand and they took me to the pavement. I knew they lived on the pavement, and they introduced me to their family. And they were the nicest people I've ever met. They were wonderful. And they lived on that pavement. And they were smart as anything. And so all I wanted to say to you was that was such an amazing lesson to me, that whatever you have in life, you can make the best of it and enjoy it. And I thank those girls for that lesson. That's it. Thank you all for bearing with me and listening to me for so long. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Alf. That was absolutely fascinating, hugely enjoyable. I love those Carpenter's Hall windows too. I remember helping to put those in. They're really striking and unusual, fantastic things. I'll be happy to take questions from anyone now. We've got one from Muna Zuberi straight away. Do you know where is the spa where the Formantrow windows were reinstalled?
They weren't Formantrow windows, they were my windows. The
sorry. Yeah.
only major job that I did in concrete and glass. It's called Rookcliffe Hall, and it's near Croft, which is near Darlington. And it's a very smart place indeed. Very smart. I'm glad we weren't paying for the coffee.
So it's near Darlington, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, we've not got any other questions in. So you'll be doubtless happy to hear after you've spoken for. There are some now. Yeah. Okay. So
yes.
Yeah. Can you see that one from Rachel?
I saw it. I saw it a minute ago. It's gone now, but it was who did the drawings of Whitefriars. Yes, I thought it was Rachel. They were done by a chap called Dennis Flanders, and he was the illustrator, I think, for Illustrated London News. But he went around all over the place doing drawings, and I think it told me really how more important drawings were than photographs, because if that had been a photograph, there would have been so many dark areas that we wouldn't have seen anything. And they were very good, very enjoyable.
And he obviously really captured the personalities of the people.
Yes. Because the pose of the people. I know that there are people from the Stained Glass website who were much involved with Swansea and the College of Art. And I know that they would recognise those people from the, they were so characteristic.
So an interesting question here from about the compatibility of glasses when you were doing fusing. Did you have any issues with it? That's from Melissa Polke.
This was amazing because we were very, very lucky, which is why I think Keith Cummings picked on Whitefriars, because the majority of the glass that we used for the stained glass was flashed glass, right? It was Whitefriars lead crystal, main part of it, coloured glass flashed on top. Now, Whitefriars glass had their own chemists, and it was very important that the coloured glass on the top of the flash glass was the same coefficient of expansion, or very near to the Whitefriars base glass. So the answer to your question is no. We were extremely lucky. We were all compatible. We never had any bothers with it. We had some bothers sometimes cooling them a bit quickly, if you go with any glass like that. No, it was a wonderful bonus for us that we could use it. If we used a bit of soda glass by mistake, we were in big trouble. So we made sure we didn't.
And John Corley wonders, he worked with Fred Cole at Canterbury Studios. Did your paths cross at all?
Oh, I met Fred Cole many times. He was on the council. You know, he didn't come up a lot, but yes, I met Fred. And then he was at Canterbury, of course. Afterwards, he was in Canterbury Cathedral workshops. And I nearly followed him, but that's a long story. We shall have to wait for another time.
Yeah. And Benjamin Finn asks, what do you think of painting on light boxes, the transition from working vertically on screens to working flat on a light box?
A brilliant question, Ben, and I love your work at Southwark. I absolutely adore it. Ben, I told you I was moonlighting for Irving Bassani. I have still got his light box in my front room. He worked on the light box sometimes, but he had a very ingenious system of mirrors. He had a flat workbench, which was glass topped. I think must have been frosted glass, I'm sure. But it had a mirror underneath it at 45 degrees that reflected the clear light from his garden. So he could paint in daylight on the flat. Now, that was a terrific bonus for his work because he used a lot of painting techniques which flooded the glass. The glass was put on and it was pushed around. It was moved around by the brush. And as it gradually dried, it produced all sorts of interesting effects. So he worked on the flat mostly. A lot of his Canterbury work was done on the flat in very small areas of time. And then he would pop in place vertically. Have a look at it. So yes, very useful that was.
Now we've got a comment from Francis Clegg, Alf, and I must say you made a heartfelt comment about those wonderful little street children in Mumbai, and you faded out. I think you were telling us to live for the moment rather, and could you repeat it perhaps because people didn't hear you?
The final bit.
Yes.
Final bit. I was just overpowered by these kids and their family. I wasn't the rich foreigner. I was just a friend, and they lived on the pavement. And I've got a house and a country cottage, and it was just the fact that they weren't scrounging; they were just being friendly. And the big brother, he worked on the railway. So he had a good job, but he still slept on the pavement. He went off to work on the railways back every morning. I think I was just trying to say, make the best of what you have in life and enjoy it. Because if you're going to worry about it, you're not going to have much fun.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and there's a message from the lovely Colette Langan. I'm glad to see he's listening, and she says she thanks you for a great talk and wonders what artist or designer has inspired you the most.
I think undoubtedly Bassani in the stained glass and John Hutton otherwise. There's one thing I'd like to say about Bassani, one other thing I learned from him. He said, there is no one piece of glass more important than another. Every glass, every piece is equally important. Even if there's a tiny little bit of background, it's still important. And I think that's pretty good advice, that, I think.
Mm. And I think perhaps a final one. We've had a lot of questions, and it's from Ruth Adams. What would you recommend as a structure for formal education in this country for stained glass, and what's needed going forward? I know this is close to your heart.
No, I think there's a need to go back to basics. I think and learn. It's old-fashioned. I know it's old-fashioned. I know I'm old-fashioned. But yes, I think you need to go back to structure and cutting and glazing and I know things have moved on. I know everybody's doing fusing. I know everybody's doing enameling. But there's still an awful lot of room for learning the basics. And I'd like to see a bit more attention to that.
I think there's nothing like being an experienced person's elbow and learning from them at the bench. I think there's an awful lot of theorising, but as you say, there's nothing like getting the practical core skills, is there?
No, because I didn't learn stained glass at the hot school. I liked art school, and was incredibly useful for me in my career was learning lettering, architecture, things like that, heraldry. Never thought I'd use them, but I did.
Great. Well, I think we'll draw a close there, Alf, and thank you from everyone very much for such a fascinating and heartfelt talk. Thank you very much.